Last week, we looked at the man named Jonathan, the man who could have or should have been king. And he had this really, really special heart. It's the same kind of heart that David will have when David arrives on the scene. He trusts God with all of his might. He says to his young armor bearer, God can save whether by many, whether by few. And he ends up climbing up that cliff and attacking a Philistine outpost and kills 20 Philistine soldiers by the hand of God. Well, the Philistines, what I didn't tell you about the story is, when the Philistines hear about all this, they see what's happened. It throws the entire massive Philistine army into disarray. And they are terrified. One man killing 20, they know it's impossible. They know that the Hebrew God must be involved. And so they are terrified, and they're running different directions, and Saul sees his opportunity. And Saul brings his little army, only now the army is growing because those who have deserted are coming back, and even more are coming. And they soundly defeat the Philistines. But now in verse 24, Saul does a bizarre thing. Saul binds an oath on all of his soldiers. Now, it's not that they take the oath. Make sure you're clear about that. It's not that they take the oath. It's that Saul places an oath on them and says, you will not taste of food until evening time. But they've been fighting, and they've been chasing the Philistines, and they're weary, and they're tired. And no food till evening time? And it says these Israelite soldiers are in great distress. Later it'll say they're about to faint from their weariness and from their tiredness. Why does Saul do such a thing? Why does Saul put such a burden on these people? And apparently Saul thinks that he'll capture the attention of God by doing so. But I'll give you a warning. If you move over in the New Testament, the Pharisees are condemned because they put burdens on the people that were unnecessary. And he said, in putting these burdens on people that are unnecessary, you make life with God even harder. And that's what Saul's doing. There's another problem. Listen to Saul's words. I don't want you to taste the food till evening time so that I can avenge myself of my enemies. Do you hear the I and the my and the mine words? If you could remember back to the lessons from the book of James, we talked about the wisdom of this world that competes within us with the wisdom of God. The wisdom of God is peace-loving and peaceable, but the wisdom of this world is selfishness that leads to jealousy, that leads to all kinds of disorder and chaos. Every time. And that's the story of Saul's life. That's the story of Saul's unraveling. You'll see it over and over again. Saul is selfish, and he becomes jealous. And there's all kinds of disarray that happens because of Saul. But he binds the people with an oath. They retreat into the woods. It gets worse. They get out there in the woods and they see that there's honey everywhere oozing from the ground. Now, have you ever been on a diet and you think you're starving? You ever been there? And you look over and there on the counter, she has made this loaf of warm bread and a pie, and you think you're starving and yet you can't touch it. It just makes matters worse. And these men are thinking they're starving, they are faint, and they see all this honey right before them, but Saul has placed them on an oath. You cannot taste it till evening time. And now Jonathan arrives. Jonathan doesn't know about the oath. Jonathan wasn't a part of the oath. He certainly didn't commit to the oath. He gets there in the woods. He's been fighting. He's been chasing the Philistines. He's weary. He just takes his staff and dips it in the honey and puts it up to his mouth, and his eyes brighten. He's getting the nourishment. And the men see soldiers see, and they're alarmed. They say, Jonathan, your father has placed us under an oath that we can't taste of any kind of food till evening time. And Jonathan's bewildered. Now don't misunderstand, Jonathan loves his father. In fact, before the stories of Saul come to an end, Jonathan will sacrifice his own life on behalf of his father. But he says, my father has caused so much trouble for Israel. Did you see how my eyes brightened when I tasted of the honey? Wouldn't it have been better to let these men eat, and then they could have even more plundered the Philistines? Now apparently the day passes, as best I can tell from the story. And they've captured from the Philistines many sheep and oxen and such as that. And they are so hungry as evening approaches that they begin to kill everything they can get their hands on, and they begin to eat. But the word comes to Saul. They're eating those animals, and they haven't properly drained the blood out of them, and that's violating the law of Moses. And now Saul gets all upset about that because we're violating the law of Moses. And he said, stop all this, bring those animals to me, I'll put them on the altar, we'll prepare them properly, and they all eat. And now Saul has this idea. Let's go in the middle of the night. Let's go in the nighttime, and let's further attack the Philistines. He's ready to go. But the priest that's there, whose name is Ahijah, says, we need to inquire of the Lord. Good advice. Now you need to understand, this same priest was praying a little earlier in this story. We didn't talk about this. But Saul grows so impatient, he said, just stop your praying, we're going to go fight. That's the mindset of Saul. The priest said we should inquire of the Lord. So the priest prays, but it says in that passage, God did not answer. God did not answer. And Saul assumes, because of the non-answer, that someone has broken his personal oath. Now, you and I need to be careful of that, because God doesn't always answer in the time frame that we think. Do you understand that? It's not necessarily an indication that something is wrong. But Saul assumes something is wrong. And he assumes that someone has broken his oath. So he says to the commanders of the men, you stand over here, and Jonathan and I will stand over here, and we're going to cast lots, and we're going to see who is guilty. Now, I don't know what casting lots means. In the New Testament, they cast lots to replace Judas, and it seems like a vote. Some say in this story, it's more like flipping a coin. And they go through this process, whatever it might be, and the men are free. It's Saul or Jonathan. So Saul stands over here, Jonathan stands over here. Saul says, we'll do this again. It lands on Jonathan. Jonathan's guilty. And Saul says to his firstborn son, you're going to die. And Jonathan will speak to him and say, all I did was stick my staff in a little bit of honey and ate a little bit of honey. And you're going to kill me? And Saul says, may God deal with me, and may it be ever so severely if I don't put you to death. Can you imagine? Can you imagine anybody going to that kind of extreme over that kind of situation? And he's going to put his own son to death. But here's a beautiful part of the story. The soldiers rise up. The soldiers rise up now in defiance against Saul. They wouldn't do it for their own good because they were starving, because they were faint. But they said, you will not harm Jonathan. You will not touch a hair on his head, because it's because of Jonathan that the God has given us this victory. It's because of his heart. It's because of his trust that God has given us this victory. And the story ends. And all week I didn't want to deal with the story. All week I wanted to go to chapter 15. Because it's a story that I find interesting, but why is it there? You may have your application. I have this one. Isn't it so interesting how we can go to such extremes on certain things, certain small things, that may not matter at all to God? And while we're going to all these extremes, could it be possible that our heart is not even close to God? See, I'll take you back again to a passage like Matthew chapter 15. One that's been quoted over and over again, I think most often out of context. But Jesus is saying to the Pharisees, you tithe your mint, your cumin, and your dill, but you neglect the weightier matters of the law, like justice and mercy. And in Matthew 15, he goes ahead to say, you will not take care of your father and mother. You'll not honor your father and mother. You'll not give them what they need. Instead, you say, we got to reserve this money for the temple treasury. We got to give this to God. And what he's saying is, instead of dealing with giving it to God, you ought to take care of your father and mother first. And that's where he begins to say now, you have all these things that you put together, these traditions and these commandments of men. And that's wherein they were making life harder for those people who were trying to come to God. But your hearts are far from me. You see the extreme on these little things? But the heart wasn't right. I remember many years ago, I was speaking at a congregation. I don't know how many people were there, but they routinely had 1,300, 1,400, 1,500, 1,600 people on a Sunday morning. I would make it a practice to go to the building early so that I could greet people early. And when I finished speaking, I would never, ever go to the back of the auditorium. I would never do that. I would stay down front. One particular Sunday morning, a man came to the front abruptly. You could tell by looking at him he was angry. And when he spoke to me, he said, I do not like this singing during communion. I remember smiling and looking at him and said, neither do I, and most people here don't. That's why we only sing during the contribution. You see, he was all worked up and so upset over some little thing he didn't even understand. He thought the contribution was the same thing as the communion. I'm not about to judge his heart. I don't know where his heart was. But I've seen people get so irate and upset over little tiny things that are not plain in Scripture and therefore probably not very important in Scripture. They get so upset. And I hate to say it, but at the same time, when you watch how they live their lives, you can't tell one bit of difference between their lives and the lives of this world. And that should never be. That should never be. But I know how the selfishness of this world creeps into our lives. And I know how we get so mixed up at times. Have you ever heard the phrase, majoring in the minors? You heard that phrase? I've told this audience on many, many occasions, I do not like the word religion because religion is different than relationship. And religion is often hollow. And religion often does just what the Pharisees did. Religion often majors in minor things that probably matter little or not at all to God and misses the heart that God is trying to build inside of each one of us through Jesus Christ. The heart that is devoted in trust. You get that down. You learn how to trust. The proper obedience will follow. And that's what Jesus had said to those Pharisees. If you get the justice and mercy down, that tithing of even your spices, that'll all work out. You got to get the big things down. I hope as a group over time we are learning to deal with the big things in our lives and not get so upset about things that are little and not plain, the big things. All that out of Saul because Saul binds on the people something for his own benefit and makes life harder for them, all the while thinking he's going to impress God, and I am relatively certain that God does not get impressed when we bind things on people that make life harder for them. So may we be pure of heart. May we be a people who love God heart first, which is what God really wants.